All right, welcome to the Week 7 Forum. This week we're looking at the sort of exception that proves the rule, radical Islamism. Political scientists often think of ideology as displacing religion in broad terms, but in many parts of the world, religion continues to dominate people's perceptions and assumptions about reality and politics. In those regions of the world where significant majorities of people continue to embrace religious convictions, and I include the United States in this statement, religion acts as a deep and powerful wellspring for ideological beliefs. The authors for many of these editions of this textbook argued that there was a clear distinction between religion and ideology. What we have learned over time is that people caught up in a religious fervor often behave so much like ideologues that we have to be open to the possibility that religion can provide a pathway to radicalization, and that the kinds of creedal passions that religion can inspire can certainly take on ideological implications. The text notes a number of radical Islamist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Lashkar-e-Taiba as illustrations of groups whose primary inspirations are religious, but whose motivations are clearly political. I would note that Islam is not the only religion that has produced an intense, and in the case of groups mentioned above, toxic ideologification, I just made up a word, of a theology. But this chapter highlights that, radical Islamism it highlights that radical Islamism precisely because it is viewed by Americans as a direct threat to our national interests and to national security. We need to be clear on the distinction between Sunni and Shiite sects of Islam. A lot of Westerners tend to try to take shortcuts and think of the differences sort of being between Protestants and Catholics within Christianity. As an analogy, that sort of comparison invites serious misapprehensions about the nature of Islam. The Sunni Shiite division emerged around, I want to say 1632 with the assassination of Ali ibn Ali Abi Talib, who was Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, and viewed by Shiites as Muhammad's rightful successor. Basically, the distinction between Shiites and Sunnis boils down to this idea of who should be caliph, and which is the sort of the leader of the Muslim world, and who should and how you should go about making that kind of selection. The Shiites contend that only a member of the House of Ali can serve as caliph, whereas Sunni Muslims basically have adopted a more pragmatic view that the caliph could be whoever could win sufficiently wide support among the Jamai or the religiously devout. Sunni Islam is by far the largest sect within Islam, representing anywhere from 75 to 90% of all Muslims, depending on who you ask, while Shiites represent anywhere from 10 to 20% of Muslims. Shiites are a significant majority. I think it's close to 90% in Iran, and among the Palestinian people, and are a significant minority in Syria. Groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS are Sunni in orientation, and much of their terrorism is sort of aimed outside of Islam, and currently that's really where a lot of the terrorism that is confronting the West is largely Sunni in character. Shiites also have a lot of militants. They are predominantly sort of trying to expand the influence of Shiism within the Islamic world. So, it's not like they're not a threat. It's just that the nature of the threat is a bit different. Is there something in Islam in particular that makes it doctrinally vulnerable to radicalization? I think I pointed to several causes of radicalization in the overview. Again, I would point to a couple of factors. Islam, from its conception, was a conquering and proselytizing religion. Its prophet Muhammad brought both the word and the sword. despite the fact that he died shortly before unifying the two major cities of Mecca and Medina on the Arabian Peninsula. He launched a religious movement that within 120 years would dominate North Africa, the Levant, and well into East Asia. Um, I would argue that the way, that's a major cause, I think, the fact that there is no separation between church and state. Another, I think, problem within the way many Muslims, I'm not going to say all, because there are some Muslim countries where this is different, but I think the way women are treated within most Muslim countries, and particularly in the Arab world, contributes to the broader patterns of radicalization. Women in the Muslim world are not equal in a legal or political or social sense. Women cannot easily divorce an abusive husband, while husbands can relatively easily divorce and basically banish their wives. In many Muslim countries, polygamy is still legal. Legally, a woman who is raped is often viewed as having harmed her family's honor, and that sometimes results in honor killings. Um, Women who refuse a man's proposal of marriage in some parts of the Islamic world risk having acid thrown in their faces as a way of defacing them and rendering them unpalatable to future husbands. Until recently, women in Saudi Arabia were not allowed to drive. Uh, Access to public education and to higher education is often segregated, with female receiving, really inadequate access to quality education. And I would argue that, again, protection of those kinds of misogynistic social practices is often a basis for radicalization. Uh, a part of the radicalization process is that you need a language of radicalization, a way of closing off avenues to compromise with rivals and opponents. Basically, radicals don't want to argue. They want violence. For radical Muslims, the concept of jahiliyyah functions much the way false consciousness does for Marxists, suggesting a kind of delusion that prevents people from seeing the true path to wisdom. Likewise, radicals twist the Islamic notion of jihad from the greater struggle, which is the struggle for internal peace and control, and shift the focus onto what historically has been the lesser struggle, which is again the struggle against infidels. Um, and then, of course, they also routinely use the idea, the Muslim practice of takfir, as a way of attacking non-radicalized Muslims, of basically saying if you don't think like me, you need to be thrown out of the club. I mentioned in the overview a number of factors that contributed to Islamism, radical Islamism. I would add another, which is a corollary to the Iranian Revolution. In 1980, President Jimmy Carter enunciated the Carter Doctrine, which asserted that the Persian Gulf was an area of vital national interest and that the United States would use military force to keep the Persian Gulf open. The Carter Doctrine was a direct threat to the freshly, newly theocratic regime of Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran. But it also had longer range consequences in that it raised American military and cultural presence in the Middle East. We put a ton of military equipment and subsequently a ton of military personnel, including lots of women, in military uniforms. And in a lot of very conservative Arab societies, that was viewed again as an affront. Okay, so the fact again that the United States, as a world power, felt as though its national interest had to be extended into the Middle East meant, culturally speaking, we were intruding in a way for a lot of Muslims. And that has fed a lot of the cultural tensions that have intensified Islamic radicalization in recent years. I think the text is right and does a good job of pointing out that an important gateway to understanding the radicalization process is to look at the writings of radicals. And they mention a guy named Sayyid Qutb, who was an Egyptian radical who helped found the Muslim Brotherhood. And he actually visited the United States in the 1940s. So let's talk about what is it that Qutb found so particularly offensive about American, values and culture in the 1940s and into the 1950s. Um, what is the radical Islamist's view of human nature? Think about, the conservative chapter from a couple of weeks ago, and especially how reactionaries, kind of within conservatism, had a very distinctive view of human nature. Is that similar to the radical Islamist's view of human nature? How does that view of human nature inform their views about the feasibility or the desirability of democracy? What is the potential, broadly speaking, for democratization in the Islamic world? Aside from the radicalization of Muslims, what other obstacles would need to be overcome? And how do you go about de-radicalizing someone once they have become radicalized? So hopefully I've given you plenty to think about and discuss as you read the material and prepare to participate in the forum. As always, if you have any questions, the forum is a great place to ask them. Let's have a great discussion.